It's almost Halloween, and what better to talk about for the spookiest day of the year than Star Wars villains? The subject of many a Halloween costume, these creepy characters are just begging to be ranked. Of course, with almost 50 years of content, it's probably impossible to rank every Star Wars villain ever, so we're just going to stick to the main villains of the movies and shows. The Villains Wiki has 766 items in the Star Wars Villains category, but I think we'll stick to the most important 50 or so. You didn't need to hear my opinions on Mergoob, did you? Obviously he's S tier, look at him. Anyway, I'm Joey from Radio Free Coruscant, and this is the Star Wars Villains tier list. Darth Vader. I don't think I need to explain to you who Darth Vader is or where he ranks on the tier list. He's one of the most intimidating and iconic villains in all of pop culture. It's very easy to get Vader wrong, and Star Wars raiders do from time to time, but when they get Vader right, he steals the show every single time. I would have to hang up my Star Wars fan license if I ranked him any lower than S for supervillain. Grand Moff Tarkin. Tarkin is a bit harder to rank. Being from A New Hope, he is of course iconic as well, but he was so smugly wrong about the Rebel attack on the Death Star that it makes him look like a bit of a fool. Fortunately, Star Wars writers opted to show us how he became so arrogant when expanding on him in Legends and canon materials, instead of doubling down on how bad his defeat made him look, like a certain more recent villain we will see shortly. I think he very solidly deserves A for archenemy. Emperor Palpatine. Another one of the greatest of all time villains, Palpatine is the concept of evil itself personified. He spent decades building trust, wealth, and political power to put himself into the perfect position to not just exterminate the beloved Jedi and overthrow democracy to make himself a dictator, but to do so to thunderous applause. I didn't even need to tell you that, because as soon as I said his name, you knew I was putting him at S tier. Boba Fett. As a bounty hunter, Boba Fett would obviously go in S tier. But as far as villains go, he's not that impressive. In Legends books and comics, he makes a compelling antagonist, but in the original trilogy he just stands around looking cool until he gets whacked into the Sarlacc pit by a blind man who doesn't even know he's there. I think it's only fair to average his on-screen score and his extended universe score and rank him at B for bad guy. Jabba the Hutt. Jabba is another one with a mismatched on- and off-screen villainy level. Unfortunately for him, he isn't anywhere near as cool as Boba Fett. Still, I think this gangster deserves B as well. Admiral Piet. I'm not ranking every Imperial officer or other minor villain, but Piet is memorable enough to make the cut. He was given an on-the-spot promotion to Admiral after Vader killed his predecessor Admiral Ozzel for ruining the Empire's surprise attack on Hoth, one of the funniest moments of The Empire Strikes Back. He was also present for the Battle of Endor, where he was killed by the A-Wing pilot that crashed into the Executor's Bridge. While I think Piet is just barely notable enough to make it to the tier list, he will not receive a high score. C for creep. Moff Jerjerrod. As the station commander for the second Death Star, I felt that Jerjerrod deserved to be ranked as well. He can go in C with Piet. Admiral Yularen. While he was introduced in A New Hope, he barely had anything to do there. In fact, he has relatively little screen time as a villain at all, as he was a hero in the Clone Wars. He can have C as well. Newt Gunray. Moving on to the prequels, we have to rank Newt Gunray. I'm not a big fan of Newt, I don't think anyone is. He's just not a super exciting or intimidating villain, and his faux Japanese accent is famously problematic. I do admire that George named him after politicians he had beef with, namely Newt Gingrich and Ronald Reagan, so that's got to get him a C too. Darth Maul. Even just on design alone, Maul would deserve an S tier, but he also happens to be one of the most interesting villains in Star Wars. From Palpatine's near-mute attack dog in The Phantom Menace, to somehow returning in the Clone Wars to get up to all kinds of hijinks, to dying in his archenemy Kenobi's arms knowing the Chosen One would avenge them both and destroy the Sith in Rebels, Maul's story is fantastic through and through. S tier. Count Dooku. The style, the panache, the signature look of superiority. I'm not sure I can give Dooku an S tier too, but it's very close. A tier. General Grievous. I think Grievous is one of the most underwhelming villains compared to his popularity in Star Wars. He's cool, don't get me wrong, but he's like Boba Fett where his main appearances are his weakest. He's fantastic in the original Clone Wars miniseries, but that's only enough to propel him to B tier. Jango Fett. Boba's father Jango is much cooler than him in the one film he's in, but outside of that is basically the same. I think it's only fair then that he be ranked the same as well. B. Archduke Poggle the Lesser. Poggle the Lesser doesn't really have a whole lot to do, but if I include Piet and Jerjerrod, I should include him as well. He doesn't really have a whole lot going for him, but he adds some interesting variety to the leadership of the Confederacy. C tier. Kylo Ren. The main villain of the sequel trilogy is of course Kylo Ren. I like Ren a lot, and I think he was an effective villain. The teenager groomed into fascism by powerful forces to reach their own goals is an interesting and timely political commentary, and the desperately wants to be as feared, respected, and powerful as his grandfather Vader inferiority complex he has makes for an entertaining contrast to Vader. I'm not sure he deserves S tier, but we don't have A.5, so I will be generous and round him up to there. General Hux. Oh, General Hux. In The Force Awakens, he was an intense and intimidating leader, delivering a fiery Hitler-esque speech and emphasizing how the First Order were the last remnant of the Empire, the fanatical true believers that were going to bring it back. But then The Last Jedi made him into such a laughingstock that he was seemingly unsalvageable, and the writers of The Rise of Skywalker decided it would be more believable for him to defect to the Resistance to try to screw over Kylo Ren, and unceremoniously killed him off to start over with a new Tarkin proxy in General Pride. Overall, an enormous waste of potential. A tier for the speech, but F for everything after that. I think that maths out to put him in D for danger. Captain Phasma. Speaking of wasted potential, how about Captain Phasma? Old Chrome Dome practically defines the term. She's got a very cool design with the chrome armor made from the plating of Palpatine's Naboo yacht and the black and red cape, plus she wasn't subjected to the kind of character assassination that Hux was, so I think she gets a C. Supreme Leader Snoke. Speaking of wasted potential, how about Supreme Leader Snoke? While the idea of a person specifically created to be Palpatine's puppet without even knowing it himself is interesting, it wasn't really executed all that well. I did like his death scene where Kylo tricks him into thinking he's about to kill Rey instead of Snoke though, so that counts for something. C. Allegiant General Pride. Speaking of wasted potential, how about... No, I'm kidding. Allegiant General Pride was fine. Richard E. Grant's Tarkin-esque performance was one of the best parts of The Rise of Skywalker, and I'd love to see the character again in some earlier story. He's appeared in books and comics already, but he could easily fit into the Imperial Remnant story of the Mandoverse. Granted, Grant is probably too old to play a 20 years younger version of the character, but I digress. B tier. BB-9E. Speaking of... Okay, I'll stop. I know I said we were only doing major villains, but I seem to remember BB-9E, or Evil BB-8, getting a lot of marketing hype that he did not live up to. D tier. Director Orson Krennic. Moving on to a more satisfactory villain, I think everyone will agree that Rogue One's Krennic is one of the best. An easy A tier for me. Dryden Voss. As much as I liked Solo, I'm not sure where to rank Dryden Voss. He was cool, I guess, but with no strong feelings either way, I think he has to be C. I'm not a big fan of Ventress personally, but she is cool, and you love to see Dooku carry on the ancient Sith tradition of secret apprentices. B. Cad Bane. One of the best bounty hunters, but not one of the best villains. As someone who didn't grow up watching the Clone Wars, I don't have the same love for him that a lot of Star Wars fans do, but I still think he deserves A. Hondo Ohnaka. I'm not sure I would call Hondo one of the best villains either, especially because he doesn't really stay a villain for that long, but I just like him. B. Savage Opress. Dooku's other secret apprentice, briefly, and Maul's brother. His storyline in the Clone Wars was pretty good, but I don't find him to be that compelling of a villain. C. Pong Krell. F. Everybody hates Pong Krell. Admiral Trench. Design-wise, he's just a giant spider in a suit. But he has some fun lines and is generally just the right kind of goofy you would expect from a Star Wars cartoon villain. B tier. Pre Vizsla. I don't really have anything to say about the leader of Death Watch. He's alright as far as villains go, his execution by Maul was intense, but I barely remembered to add him. I would give him a C. Mother Talzin. The Night Sisters are really cool, but Mother Talzin isn't my favorite. C tier. Governor Price. Moving on to Rebels, I think Governor Price is a really underrated Imperial character. She is very effective, to the point that she's actually the last villain standing in that show. She isn't spectacular by any means, but certainly deserves to be put in B tier. Grand Admiral Thrawn. What even is there to say about Thrawn that hasn't been said a million times before? He's undoubtedly the most famous character from Legends, if not from outside the main films in general. While the canon version may not entirely live up to the original, he is still a spectacular villain. You already know where he belongs. S tier. Agent Kallus. It's very hard to rank villains that switch sides and become heroes. Kallus's story is a very good example of that though, and even before we knew that was going on, he was still the perfect antagonist for the Ghost crew. A tier. Grand Inquisitor. Most people's famous Inquisitor. Arguably the only good Inquisitor. He has several great lines, and his final duel with Kanan is fantastic. A tier. Kragan Gore. Captain Kragan from Resistance was alright. Pirates are cool, and his cobbled together ships were interesting, but nothing special. C tier. Commander Pyre. Commander Pyre is just a gold version of Captain Phasma. While I kind of like the idea of First Order officers wearing metallic armor, I think it would be better if it were all of them or just one. Having specifically two is kind of odd. D tier. Agent Tierney. Tierney is marginally better than Pyre. She has a more interesting role and manages to convince one of the protagonists to join the First Order. Even so, I can't give her more than a C. Vice Admiral Rampart. The Bad Batch does a lot of things right, and its villains are some of the best. Rampart slowly becoming one of the most significant figures of the post-Clone Wars era, only to be abruptly thrown under the bus by Palpatine, is one of my favorite villain story arcs in Star Wars. He isn't the best Bad Batch villain though, so he only rises to A tier. Dr. Hemlock. That honor goes to Dr. Hemlock, one of the most sinister non-Sith Star Wars villains. He's creepy and conniving, and comes within inches of making Palpatine immortal using his cloning technology on Mount Tantus. He's probably my favorite Star Wars animation villain, so he must go at S tier. Crosshair. Another one of those pesky redemption arcs. Crosshair made a good villain for the first season and a half or so of The Bad Batch, but he isn't a villain anymore. B tier. CX2. Like I said before, I wasn't going to include minor villains, but CX2 was too good to skip. This clone boogeyman isn't exactly the most well-written character out there, but he makes up for it in just how unsettling he is. His voice changer, his ship, his infiltration skills, all add up to a rather frightening villain. B tier. Moff Gideon. Moving to the Mandalorian era, we must next rank Moff Gideon. He was set up to be a spectacular villain, but then his death at the end of Season 3 was just so abrupt and underwhelming that it took him down a notch. It really seemed like we were missing 15 minutes or so of the space battle with the stolen Arquitans, and while that has nothing to do with Gideon, it would have made the part where they drop it on his head feel less like it just came out of nowhere. B tier. Gorian Shard. Hardly a major villain, but I wanted to include him since his pirate faction will be the villains of the upcoming Skeleton Crew. There isn't much to say about him, but I don't need to. He's a plant monster pirate. B tier. Pike Syndicate. I couldn't leave out the Book of Boba Fett, but it didn't really have a specific antagonist, just the Pike Syndicate in general. And they were not the best. E for Empty Threat. Morgan Elsbeth. Ahsoka had a disproportionate number of villains, but they were all good. Morgan was, seemingly, until the very last minute, the one in charge, and her soft betrayal by Thrawn and the Great Mothers, followed by the fight against Ahsoka, was outstanding. She also got a bit of backstory later on in Tales of the Empire. I'm not her biggest fan, but I think she still gets an A. Baylan Skoll. Baylan Skoll and his views on the Jedi were easily one of the most interesting parts of the Ahsoka series. His brutal and efficient fighting style was spectacular to watch as well. I simply have to give him S tier, although if they write him out of Season 2 or replace him with a Luke Skywalker-style CGI concoction, I'm not going to be pleased. Shin Hati. His faithful assistant Shin will not rank as highly. She's alright, but doesn't really get a lot to do. She appears to have been set up for something interesting in Season 2, but for now she can only be B tier. Marok. I remember there being so much speculation on which Inquisitor he was going to be, or if he would be someone else like Ezra or Galen Merrick. Then halfway through the season he just dies and explodes into green smoke. I was certain all along that he wouldn't be anyone in particular, so this was a hilarious end for that speculation saga to me. Doesn't do him any favors in terms of scoring, though. As much as I like him, I think he can only get D tier. The Great Mothers. Seriously, like over half of the cast were villains. I can't really rank the Great Mothers as we don't know that much about them yet. They were pretty cool, and I'm looking forward to seeing what they have planned in Season 2 though, so that gets them a C tier. Third Sister, or Reva Seavander. Okay, so I like Reva as a character. I think the idea of a Jedi youngling surviving not just the Jedi Purge, but specifically Vader's Jedi Temple rampage, and then going on to join the Empire as an Inquisitor to try to get revenge, is fascinating. However, that concept deserved to be the protagonist of its own story, not the villain of someone else's, to get the focus it deserved. It's hard to decide where to rank Reva with that in mind, but I think a C is fair. Cyril Karn. The initial villain of Andor is a delightfully slimy, uncharismatic, power-hungry corporate stooge. His flop of a speech to rally the troops before the Ferrix raid is hilarious, and his obsession with Dedra Meero is legendarily creepy. He's great, but maybe not A or S tier great. B. Dedra Meero. Dedra, on the other hand, is one of the best-written Imperial characters ever. The way her struggles with her colleagues make you want to root for her until she goes to Ferrix and shows you how evil she truly is masterful writing. She's also one of the most ruthlessly effective officers in the Empire, an organization that is all too often depicted as comically incompetent for laughs. But her competence not only makes her a better villain, but uplifts the heroes as well by making their inevitable victory against her all the more impressive. Both on her own and in contrast to her other Imperial peers, she is outstanding. S tier. May and Osha Anasaia. And at last we come to the most recent Star Wars show, The Acolyte. Much like Reva, I like May and Osha in concept, but not in execution. Their story is interesting, but doesn't really play out as well as you would hope. Osha's fall and May's redemption seem to go way too quickly, and their actress was betrayed by weak writing at some of the most critical moments in the series. I loved The Acolyte, and was devastated that it wasn't renewed for a second season, but even I must admit that May and Osha cannot rank highly on the tier list compared to who else is on there, and put them at E. The Stranger. The Stranger, on the other hand, oh boy. I mean, first of all, The Stranger is the most foreboding name I've ever heard for a villain, invoking thoughts of stranger danger and making his grooming of May and Osha to the dark side all the more ominous. Then his costume is incredible, his fight choreography is insane, and his dialogue makes you understand why so many people joined the Sith. Really, the show should have been about him from the start. That's sort of what it was described as initially, and while the why-done-it mystery we got was pretty good, I think the show would have benefited from more of him in it. I suspect that with Osha, ostensibly our secondary protagonist, joining him at the end of the season, we would have seen a lot more from the Sith perspective in Season 2. But unfortunately, we will never know. The Stranger is easily one of my favorite Star Wars villains of all time, and it is a genuine shame that we will not get to see any more of him or his master Plagueis in the future. Honorary S tier to Plagueis, by the way. I can't rank him on this list as I'm sticking to just the main antagonists of the shows and movies, but I thought he'd at least deserve a shout-out. Maybe I should have done a Sith tier list instead. That would have been way more spooky for Halloween. Anyway, the Stranger, also known as Chimere, is by far one of the most sinister Sith to ever grace our screens, making our final character a well-deserved S tier. And that, finally, is my ranking of every main show and movie villain in Star Wars. Or perhaps more accurately, every villain I could think of. I'm sure I forgot plenty of important ones, and I willingly left out literally hundreds of others, so let me know if I missed your favorite in the comments. I'd also like to hear what you think of my ranking, and what other topics to rank in the future. But that's enough chit-chat, since this appears to be my longest script yet, at over 3,500 words. I will see you next week. RFC, out.